Good afternoon. I'm Susan Williamson, the festival director. Welcome to the 17th Annual Palm Beach Poetry Festival, Thomas Lux Memorial Special Guest Poet Interview with Gregory Orr by Laure-Anne Bosselaar. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our founder and president, Miles Kuhn, and his wife, Mimi, our sponsors, Morgan Stanley's Legacy Group of Atlanta, Gladstone Multimedia, the Cultural Council of Palm Beach County, Visit Florida, Murder on the Beach Bookstore, the National Endowment for the Arts, and all our other sponsors and supporters without whom we would have no festival. Don't forget to use your Q&A and chat features on Zoom during the presentation. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to this interview with Gregory Orr and Laure-Anne Bosselaar. Both Greg and Laure-Anne were longtime friends of Thomas Lux, and therefore we hope that this event will be a tribute to Tom, whose presence I feel during this special week. And that Greg, our 2021 Thomas Lux Memorial Special Guest Poet, as he's interviewed by Laure-Anne, will also feel that great presence we had with him for so many years with his guidance. So we'll begin the event with something quite special. Greg has recorded a special video that tells us a little story and a poem that was inspired by Thomas Lux and is dedicated to his memory. We will never forget him. Here we go.
I first met Tom Lux back in 1973, though I'd heard of him and read his poems for several years before that. In fact, I met him when I gave my first poetry reading at Emerson College, first poetry reading I ever gave, and it was also during my wife's and my honeymoon. I first met the poet Bill Knott way back in 1968. Around 1990 or so, Bill gave his dear friend Tom a bright scarlet t-shirt with poetry written across the front. Having known Bill pretty well, I'd say that it was a gift that mingled generosity, passion, and mischievous challenge. Tom declined the implied challenge to wear such a bold, even outrageous item. Tom was always a dapper and fairly conservative dresser, even then. Tom's legendary generosity had none of the unconscious aggression that made Bill Knott such a complicated person. And so Tom passed that loud t-shirt along to me. I wore it, always, cherished it, and the rest of the story is in the poem. Scarlet t-shirt, the lyric muse, for Tom Lux and Bill Knott. I know I'm vulgar, but so was noble Catullus. Nor does Latin lend his lines a dignity my Anglo-Saxon lacks. And what about Sappho? Didn't her poems full of moans teach us that passion is the only song that lasts? Let her sister muses keep their curves chastely garbed, their tresses bound up in formal buns. Hell, let them dress in prose like Joseph's many-colored coat, a fitting emblem of the world's variety and splendor. But she must go naked, or in something intense and crude, like this scarlet t-shirt a poet gave a poet years ago. And he gave it to me. Too loud for him, just right for me. So what if it's faded and tattered past all mending? Tonight, my wife pulls it on over her beautiful shoulders to wear to bed. 10 years ago, the fabric was intact, its hues bright as a macaw's plumes. Now it's a memento mori peekaboo. Through its erotic, oracular gaps, I glimpse her ribs, swell of a breast. What breaks the heart and will not let it rest.
Wonderful. Can you hear me, Gregory?
Yes, I can.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
It's so good to have you. I'm delighted with that poem and with the little holes in the t-shirt that suddenly become something else. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very quickly going to talk about all the wonderful things you've done, and then we'll start the interview. You're the author of 8 books of poetry, 4 volumes of criticism, and a memoir. You received numerous awards for your work, as if you didn't know this. Most recently, the Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. You taught at the University of Virginia since 1975 and were for many years the poetry editor of the fabulous Virginia Quarterly Review. We're so happy to have you here and look forward to spending some time with you, and then tomorrow to seeing you in the performance with the Parkington Sisters. Thank you so much for accepting to chat with us. So you taught at the University of Virginia for 44 years. I mean, you must have so many students, and are now at last retired. I said at last, but are there moments when you miss the old teaching days?
Well, the simple answer there is that I frequently dream that I'm teaching. And so I guess it's still going on in some part of me. The other half of the answer is that once I knew I was going to retire, I tried to put pretty much everything that I had thought and taught over those 4 decades plus into a book called A Primer for Poets and Readers of Poetry. Oh, thank you there. Now I don't have to hold it up. Yes. Anyway, this is what they call a plug, isn't it? Anyway, yes. Actually, the truth of it is, I mean, that I love teaching. I love thinking about poetry and writing about it as well. So I tried to put as much as I could into that book, so that it's not unlike it's my idealized version of how I taught, which is to say, every time you teach, you always think, oh, I forgot this, I didn't mention that, or, you know, all of us as teachers
yes.
know,
yeah.
Oh, the semester's over and I never did this and that. So I had leisure to put that together, and there it is.
Well, I highly recommend it. And as you can see, there are many parts that I loved. It's a technicolor enthusiasm for the book. Speaking of teaching, who were your teachers when you were a younger poet, and what are some lessons from them that you have carried with you in your writing life?
Well, I didn't have any poetry workshops until
Right.
I went to get an MFA at Columbia. In a sense, I was sort of invited there by Mark Strand, who had visited Antioch College where I taught, where I was a student, and he had been a student also years before. And Mark, at the suggestion of a teacher there, looked at some poems of mine. And in Mark's manner, he said, well, these aren't any good, but
So
if you come to Columbia, I could teach you how to write. Well, good enough. And then he left, which was good for me. I could not have taken more than one lesson couched in those terms. So,
Right.
so I ended up at Columbia, and there, Mark was a teacher of mine for a while, but Stanley Kunitz was there.
Oh,
Stanley
wonderful.
was at that time completely unknown to me,
Right,
both as
right.
poet and person. And as many, many people, well, practically everybody will tell you, he was a great teacher and a great spirit.
Yeah.
And
a good man, a good heart.
Yes, a good heart and a smart mind and a high sense of the calling of poetry, which was also, I think that's important when you're young.
Yeah.
He gave I had a real sense of the dignity of the calling.
Right, right. And do you still have teachers now that teach you through their books or through history? And are there poets that still teach you in some way or another?
Well, yeah, the truth is at my age, I don't have any fellow poets that I could show my work to anymore. That possibility is just not in my life.
Right.
An odd thing about me is that the poets that I feel closest to are really pretty far back. How shall I do this? Sappho, Wordsworth, Whitman, Dickinson. I read them constantly.
There you go.
And I learn from them constantly. Now, how you can learn from Wordsworth, I couldn't even get my students to read Wordsworth. So how can I explain that I, in the 21st century, feel like I'm learning something from? I don't know what I'm learning even really, except that, well, what would I learn from Wordsworth? That having grown up in a rural area in the countryside, I knew in my own bones that sense of solitude and even loneliness, and then the consolations of being in nature.
Right.
Mary Oliver has a wonderful book, essay about this, called Upstream.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just when you get that spirit, and Mary was a great reader of Wordsworth as well, you know, and again, you know, it's hard to confess because he's really got some problems. But there you go.
I agree, but they continue teaching us, you know. I mean, Kunitz teaches me every time I return to him. I mean, we never stop learning.
No.
Tell us about your days now that you're no longer a teacher, and about that little place. Is that a cottage or a little writing room that you have in your garden?
Yes. Let's see. What is that? That is a product of two historical events. I got an NEA grant many, many years ago, 30 years ago, you know, and there it is. You can buy some time. You teach full time. We give you this money. We just bought you a year off. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's exciting, a whole year off. I talked to some poets and I said, what did you do in your grant? What did you do with all that freedom? And they said, God damn, I didn't do anything. I meant to. I was going to write all these poems, but somehow the time just went by and I didn't. So I thought, that's scary.
Yeah.
At the time, my daughters were very young, like 8 and 5, and quite lively. So the cottage became this, it's a little 12 by 12 cottage there that had built. I bought space instead of time, if that makes sense, with my grant money. And it's still there and I still use it, so that was a good decision to choose space over time. It didn't make sense at the beginning, but and my kids could run wild in the house, which was just right.
How perfect.
A little hard for
and
my
it's
wife.
Still there. I mean, yeah. That it's still there is wonderful. And so you still go there. You go there and you write every day or every other day.
I write every day. I just, when I was in college, I thought, all I want to do is write poems. Nobody's going to pay me to do this.
Exactly.
Nobody wants me to do it. Your best friends don't want you to write poems. They certainly don't want you to show them to them. At least my friends didn't.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I'm in this on my lonesome. I better get some discipline.
Yeah.
So way back then, I just learned to set aside mornings and just make myself write every day. And I still do. I mean, I still write 7 days a week, that is to say, sit down with good intentions and 4 hours or 6 hours in front of me and a lot of coffee and see what happens.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Because of going through almost a year, all of us, everybody, all the people listening to us, going through almost a year of pandemic nervousness and physical distancing and political turmoil and all that mess we had in 2020, we all carry some degree of grief and nervousness and anxiety on our bodies and hearts. And for a resilient survivor like you, how are you living this pandemic? Did it teach you something?
Well, when you're a poet, you kind of listen. Poetry, my feeling is we don't always know what's going on inside us. We don't know what we're thinking or feeling. And we wait for language or imagery to come along and sort of inform us.
Yeah.
The same way that dreams come along. We don't control them, they just appear and they have some kind of structure and process.
Yeah.
But of course, with a poem, you're hoping for more than a dream. And what I found happened to me in the pandemic was, of course, this enormous sense of anxiety and fear. And I'm not a spring chicken, so this is not a mild fear. And what happened for me, what the way poetry told me to cope with it is a way that it's spoken to me before about obsessive material. And that is, it says, how about a villanelle? And I'm thinking, whoa, okay, I'm a free verse poet, period. That's all there is to it.
You're not a formalist, yeah.
I'm not used to forms and I don't like forms. And then there's this one damn exception to that rule of Orr, and that is villanelles. For some reason, I've written maybe 10 villanelles before. Well, during the pandemic, I wrote about 16. Why do you write villanelles? Well, because they're obsessive. They repeat again and again. And you were talking about pantoums, which function that way for you. Makes all the sense in the world. Except that I guess a pantoum seems to me to be moving forward. One of the crazy things about a villanelle is you just keep ending up where you started by repeating those lines, you know?
Yep.
And of course, you are going to move to some transformation in the great villanelles. Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle, Bishop's One Art. I mean, they're going to get somewhere, but they're going to go through repetitious, obsessive hell to get there. And somehow that was the pandemic for me, just this, you know, obsessing, right?
Please read one or two of them, please.
That does sound like a lead-in, doesn't it? Okay, here we go.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is Pandemic Villanelle Touching on Love. And it has an epigraph from Whitman. What is less or more than a touch? Once what we loved, we could also touch. We were spoiled and didn't even know. When that was gone, we saw it was luck. Just about then, the going got rough. We're deeply social animals, and so what we love, we also like to touch. Sounds so simple, yet it means so much. And when that pleasure vanishes, no way to replace it. We saw it was only luck, and luck is fickle. So now we're fucked. That stark lesson, easy come, easy go. And even if you love it, you can't touch. And it means anyone you long to clutch or hug, gestures washed away in the flood. Now all that's gone, and you see it was only luck. Go ahead, rage and blame, claim that life sucks. Bitterness, that stupidest of stances here below. Better to grieve for what you love to touch. Admit joy's gone for now. Your joy that was luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I have never heard the F word rhyme with luck and off rhyme with touch. It's lovely. Thank you so much. Do you have enough? Just one more, and then we'll go.
Sure. This is we were talking the other day before this. This is like a shorter lined one, so it gets a little jauntier. It's called Pandemic Lockdown Villanelle Blues.
Yes, that's a good one.
I might as well live until I lose. Why pretend there's another way? It's not as if I'll get to choose. Again, I scan the morning news, and it seems we're all at bay. So might as well live until we lose. Place your bet, pay your dues. Who isn't neck deep in the fray? It's not as if we get to choose. Now my songs are all the blues. What else can anyone say? Might as well live until we lose. Molds growing on my travel shoes. Guess I'm here till I turn to clay. But it's not as if I get to choose. Sun goes down, I hit the booze. It's one more anxious COVID day.
Yeah.
But it's not as if we get to choose. So I might as well live until I lose. There.
Thank you so much. So much. Thank you. And I'd love to tell our listeners that this is a premiere. Nobody has ever heard them before. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Even my wife won't read them. Even my wife won't read them. She says they're a little depressing and she has enough problems right now.
Okay, well, we are delighted. We really are. One of the wonderful aspects of the Palm Beach Poetry Festival is that, and thank you, Mimi, and thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jennifer Litt, and thank you, Miles, and thank you, everybody. One of the wonderful aspects of the Palm Beach Poetry Festival is that we all go into a week-long total immersion in the art and craft of poetry. And you know this because you visited us before.
Yes.
We come together for a whole week to listen, write, and study its craft from so many angles and focus. In a primer for poets and readers of poetry, you say something about the difference between the lyric and the narrative that I find so helpful, because I have so many students who ask me for that difference. A lyric focuses on a single dominant emotion that constellates the poem's language around a center. The lyric isn't going anywhere because the lyric poet digs where he or she stands. In contrast, a narrative isn't going anywhere. If a narrative isn't going anywhere, it's in danger of failing. So what is it in the lyric that you love so much and chose, and that you could not find in the narrative?
Well, I'll go all the way back. I'll mention one of my heroes, Sappho, who one of the initiating lyric poets of the Western world. And a fragment of hers called Fragment 16 is one that I totally adore, that to me is the ultimate articulator of what's going on in a lyric poem. And she begins that poem by talking about what excites the males around her, what they think is worth looking at. Her poem goes like this, the opening stanza. Some say an army marching, or a raiding fleet under sail, or cavalry charging is the most beautiful sight on this black earth, or a Trump assault, let's say. But I say, whatever one loves most is beautiful. Whatever one loves most is beautiful. To me, what the lyric can do is it can articulate that personal point of view and turn it into value. Say, I don't give a damn what these macho guys say about armies and, you know, that raiding fleets and that destructive bullshit.
Right.
You know, and then she goes on to talk about her lover, an Actoria, and how she has this wonderful way of walking and also a really lovely smile. And I think, well, that's what lyric does. It says, you know, we're nobody. Each of us is nobody, we're this individual self. And through the magic of lyric, poem, and song, that I becomes a possible creator of meaning and value. And
connects with
love that.
the world. Yeah.
Whatever one loves most is beautiful. Okay, so that's written in the 6th century BC, but it's still true.
I
mean, if it's
today.
still, if we don't, you know, well, no.
Go ahead.
So there's lyric for you. Now, I mean, narrative does so many other wonderful things, none of which I understand because I can't do them. But lyric, one of the wonderful things I like that somebody once said about lyric is that it takes this crisis moment in a narrative and it just it dramatizes the crisis moment, you know, not the stuff on either side of it. And of course, if you're a narrative poet, you value the whole flow of it, and I get that. But for me, you know, the crisis is the moment. Well,
You have
yeah.
in
And it's
another book,
temperamental thing.
pardon?
I think it's a
Oh,
temperamental thing. I mean, I think,
yeah,
you know, I could study writing narrative poetry my whole life, and I would never get past mediocre. Whereas lyric,
it's
there's
your
some,
song.
you know, something in it that's right for
Yeah.
me. I hope.
And what's wonderful is in a chapter that's called Words Coming Alive in Poems, you set up 4 categories of lyrical language, right? Not language, but lyrical language: naming, singing, saying, and imagining. Could you briefly or not briefly explain each category?
Well, I think of them as powers that language has, that just inhere in the language that we use. And it seems to me everybody who thinks about poetry agrees, well, poetry is language at its most intense and concentrated and meaningful.
Yeah.
And felt to me, I don't know, I just sort of made up these categories, I guess. You know, it's not like I invented them or anything. They're not. Anybody else wants to claim them, that's fine. I don't care. But things that you can do with language. And then, of course, in a wonderful poem, you do everything with language. But the power of language to name, the power of nouns to go out in the world and say, you know, bluebird,
Yes.
maple tree. That's just, and there they are. You know, they're conjured into being. So that naming is an enormous power. And I think there was a Brazilian theorist of education, sort of a radical. He had this wonderful thing that he said about language. He talked about the power of the language, that a human task was naming our world in our words, which again is Sappho, you know, and the our world in our words is again that empowerment that comes from being able to articulate the world as we experience it. Again, I think that's one of the things that naming does. You can, I remember a friend once said, oh my God, this poet taught me I could name the trees that were in my yard where I grew up. And that was so exciting.
Kunitz did that so well, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And once you name, you've dignified your existence and the existence of the world around you. You've conjured it. So naming, singing is just the astounding rhythms and pleasure that we get out of sounds and silences and stuff. And you know, endless. Who will ever get to the bottom of them? The mysteries of sound and rhythm. Saying. Saying is just this crazy thing that we do with language that I kind of love. It's like we'll say something, and it sounds like it's so true.
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, Auden, we must love one another or die. Or when I quote in there at the beginning of Musée des Beaux-Arts, he says, about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. And you just think, what the heck? That's bullshit. But it's rhetoric is what it is. It's that we want to believe and we love the authority of claims like that. I mean, we don't want a lot of them, and they have to feel as if they're supported by the poem. We can't just make up a list of big, deep sounding things. But, you know, when Sappho says, whatever one loves most is beautiful, I mean, that's just a claim.
Yes.
No, but I love it. It's a saying that has such power, truth power, it seems. Yeah. And then imagining metaphors. I mean, you know, metaphors. I don't know what to say about metaphors, but that's, you know.
We couldn't live as poets without metaphors. I mean,
no. And Aristotle.
Or without singing, or without naming, or without saying, you know. But I just wanted to hear you talk about it. And you talk about it so well in the book.
Well, it's so exciting when you write a poem because you don't, it's not like you say, well, now I'm going to do some naming and now I'll do some singing and saying. It's not like that. It's just
No.
that you know, they're all jostling around as possibilities inside you in this
Yeah.
language that wants
Yeah.
to come to the surface. At least that's the way I experience it. And who knows what form it will take, but it's
Exactly.
quite amazing. Metaphors. Aristotle said, again, 5th century BC or something, you know, metaphors are the clearest sign of genius. He claims, you know, you can argue with him, but I mean, it's just that they're just have such a, they capture us.
Mhm.
When someone makes a great metaphor, you just think, wow, I don't know. Poetry, it's so cool.
In an essay entitled Writable Radiance, you address another point that seems to interest more and more writers of all genres, and that is the hybrid of lyric and prose. And you used that in your memoir, you know. And so my question is actually very clear for me, but I hope you will understand it. How do you know when to switch? When to, in your memoir, write about the memory and about the memoir and suddenly switch into a prose poem like lyricism? How do you know that?
Yeah.
Or is it
yeah.
instinctive?
Gosh.
If you don't want to
Yeah,
answer, never mind, but it was so
yeah,
mysterious.
But you
How do
mentioned
we
that
know?
that hybrid form. It's called a haibun. It's a Japanese term.
Yes,
There's
the haibun.
one,
Yeah.
and the form that it that
Does that?
Basho, the poet we know is a haiku poet in the West, Basho, this great master, wrote a book called The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And that's where I first ran across this. It's like a travel journal. He goes on a journey on foot, and it's a travel journal. But he'll stop at a temple or someplace or a stream, and he writes a haiku. And so the book itself is this description of his journey, and then this haiku appears. And then you go, look at another haiku. Then I spent a night at this old temple, and there were mosquitoes all around and stuff, and boop, there's this little poem about mosquitoes.
Well, that's a very good simile, a very good comparison, that suddenly it pops, suddenly the lyric poem or the prose poem comes out of it on its own. It's almost invited by what precedes, right?
Yeah. And you know, one of my favorite books in the world is Baudelaire's Paris Spleen. It's a collection of prose poems.
Yes.
You know, more or less, we say he invented the prose poem form in the West. You can argue if you want, who cares? But it's his preface to it. He says, "What poet has not dreamed of a rhythmical prose?" And you know, that's again one of these invitations to get this heightened intensity of language into prose. It's exciting. It's funny you mentioned the memoir, because there was a certain point in the memoir when I was trying to write a chapter about my father's amphetamine addiction. And this is the memoir, actually. Where is it?
Oh, sorry, am I showing the wrong book?
Here we
sorry,
go.
I have.
He shows the book.
Oh, that's it. Of course, I have it too. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go
Anyway,
ahead.
it's called The Blessing. But I was writing about my father's. He was a country doctor, and you know, sort of low-key addicted to amphetamine and sleeping pills. Low-keyed? I don't know. Anyway, I wrote this poem about it at a certain point, about his addiction, and it got too intense for the memoir, and I just ended up publishing it as a separate prose poem, If There's a God, you know, it sort of concentrated itself beyond memoir form. And yet, as you say, it's one of the best pieces of advice I got about the memoir when I tried to write it. Was not much fun to write. Was think of the chapters as prose poems.
Yeah.
And that was a great piece of advice to give to a lyric poet.
How wonderful, how wonderful. And then there's your moving and latest book, The Last Love Poem I Will Ever Write. And you caught me with that one because when I saw the title of the book, of course, I wanted to read the poem right away. And I said, how does he know? How does he know that this is the last love poem? And of course, you tricked us into what I'm not going to say because I'm going to ask you to read it. But out of the survival of personal trauma or chaos or pain or all of these combined, you seem to find new ways and new angles from which to face these experiences. And I love how you obviously have this love relationship and pleasure with language and humor and tongue in cheek, right? And importantly, about the power of language. And there's that gorgeous lyricism in the book and meditative moments, but also wit and hope and a kind of playfulness. And I was wondering if you would read to us the poem Inscription that I love so much.
Sure.
Because it has all of that together in it.
I like the idea of wit and humor being I don't know, in the 17th century, which is 18th century English part, which is not what I read, and I couldn't read it really, but they did. Then they used to, their word for imagination was wit, you know? And so, I mean, there is a kind of, without playfulness, where would we be? And this again, here's my friend Sappho in here. Inscription. All this winter afternoon spent reading about ancient Greek lyric and the invention of the simple alphabet. How those small marks on papyrus changed everything. Persuaded lyric poets they could become immortal. Someone will remember us, wrote Sappho, naming herself and those she loved in poems that are only fragments and a single one that's whole, a prayer to Aphrodite. An old man with a full bladder, I paused to step out back, where yesterday's flurries have made the lawn into a blank page, in a small corner of which I piss out the hot stream of my own being. Grateful to be part of that holy and hopeless story by which poets send past death their praise of life and write their names on the vanishing page.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course, the joke is it's a guy poem.
It's a guy poem. And
was,
believe me, I envy not being able to write poetry in the snow outside on a
I just made it up. I didn't really do it. But I did love saying Aphrodite, an old man with a full bladder. I don't know exactly how
one poem.
Yeah, I don't know, near each other so that there's some kind of song going on there. I don't know what it is. Somebody, an expert could tell us, but it was just fun.
That's exactly why I asked you to read it. I think you've been extremely generous with your answers. So I'm going to jump 18 questions and ask you to read the last poem I will ever write. Because it's such a surprise when you hear the title and then you hear the poem, you realize that the poems over there still to be written, and I didn't know that. And I love the imagery and the metaphors in this poem. So if you could read that as a goodbye, as a closing, although I had so many questions still to ask you, but maybe if at the end of the Q&A, maybe I'll ask you one or two more questions. Could you read the last poem I will ever write?
Sure. By the way, someone should have warned you that when people ask me something, I don't give sensible short answers. I just get excited.
That's what I love. Thank you. I mean, that's the dream of the interviewer.
Yeah, well,
You know.
you could say, hey, what about these questions that he didn't answer? Anyway, here we go. The last love poem I will ever write will contain an invention for turning ants' tears into hummingbird wings. It will hold every elegy the night sky ever wrote for the moon. It will reveal the answer to the question, yes. It will feature a rose bush that grew naturally into the shape of a woman, a man, and a dog. It will contain all our sorrow and some of our joy. It will exhibit glass slippers worn by the last queen of mice, and also the invisible cathedral built on the spot where we met. It will display a tree whose leaves change color with the weather, turning bright blue at 40 degrees. It will contain a replica of the ice ship that sails through dreams, searching for survivors. It will contain all our joy and most of our sorrow.
That's such a beautiful poem. It will hold every elegy the night sky ever wrote for the moon. I mean, really. And glass slippers worn by the last queen of mice. That just took me for an hour into my imagination. And it will reveal.
I hope it might. I hope it would be fun to.
Oh, I would love to write a poem about the last queen of mice all of a sudden. So thank you.
There you go. You're going to do it.
Yes,
that's
I'm
all you need. All you need is,
so,
wow, I can do that. You know, I think this was actually a challenge to my students. I think it was on two topics. One was writing their last love poem. Just what would that be?
Yes.
The other one was something that my students said, well, we don't know how to make things up. So it's easy. Just go crazy, you know?
Yeah.
It's a little bit where like Tom and I started out, you know, as sort of 70s
surrealist
when we were young poets. And
yes.
You know.
Tom was a surrealist for a minute and a half, and then he changed, you know, then he became the king of syntax. But what I envy the most in your poem is it will reveal the answer to the question, yes. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. We're going to open it to question from the audience, and hopefully maybe I can ask you one or two more if the audience is a little shy. So thank you, dear Greg. Thank you.
My total pleasure. Shall we?
Now we have to wait for some technical miracle.
Hello, thank you for such a wonderful interview, the two of you. I could listen to you forever. Keep going. Just to remind everyone, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which is where you can submit your questions. And the chat is, of course, open for the rest of your responses as well. We'll kick off with the first question. Actually, two people asked the same question, which is, do you have a favorite translation of Sappho that you like to keep nearby?
It's a really interesting question, because my answer is something like this. My answer is, I was thinking about it the other day. When I was a kid, my parents had a really kind of good library. And my mom died when I was 14. She got me started reading, or I'd started reading when she was alive, but I also would spend a lot of time on her bookshelves looking at books after she was gone. And one of them was Mary Barnard's translation of Sappho. And so I kind of cherished it, partly because it was some relic from my mom. And also the thing of these were done probably in the 40s or 50s. I'm just guessing on that. But what Barnard did that I didn't understand is this. There is no introduction. So you don't know a thing about who Sappho is. You don't know these are fragments of poems. I thought they were whole poems, like really short, strange poems. And she gives them titles. Now, they had no titles. The story of Sappho is that what we know about her is she gets quoted in different people's writing about poetry. And they say, oh yeah, you all know this poem about Sappho, where she's talking about the young woman that, you know, I don't know what it was. Anyway, so I got her all wrong, but I fell in love with this stuff anyway. And so then I, you know, read other versions and learned a lot more. I think my answer is that I probably read about 5 or 6 different translations of hers. I don't so much like the ones, and I know this will upset people, Anne Carson sort of modernized or contemporized them a lot and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's an actual classical scholar. I love her book, Eros the Bittersweet, but that didn't work so much for me. So I do sort of more ordinary ones, and I let my imagination fill in the gaps.
There's a question by Tim Seibles that I like very much. Aren't there lyrical moments in narrative poems? Isn't that where narrative poems get their power?
Have to be. Absolutely. Perfectly said. Yeah. If there were no lyric moment in a narrative poem, it would be very, very boring. And of course, what narrative poems often do is they build toward that moment of intensity. Wonderful poem by Robert Frost called Directive, where he just, you know, it takes you on his journey. You're wandering around on the mountains and so on and so forth. And you find this, you know, just going through these crummy woods and stuff, and you find this broken down house. Then you go out back, and what he really wants to show you, you've been following this guy, which is to say you're in a narrative, following him on a journey. And he says, and then there's this tree by a spring, and you bring out this little cup that the kids left in the tree, in its hiding place in the tree, and he says to take this little cup and, you know, weep because the kids are no longer there, and it's all this. And he says, and the last line is, drink and be whole beyond confusion. And it's like, oh yeah, that's this incredible lyric moment. But the poem itself is almost deliberately like boring narrative journey to me. So yeah, that's what, you know, absolutely. They're not separate forms. And of course, lyrics try to, you know, include narratives as well. I mean that, but there's still, I'm still going to say there's this temperament. Some friends of mine who are narrative poets, and they just say, you know, you leave out so much of the world when you write a lyric poem. And then I say, you know, you include so much. I get bored. I'm a thrill seeker.
May I just make a quick parenthesis, because what happened to me was I was a narrative poet to get rid of that past. And then now all I think about is the lyric.
Yeah.
Because the room has been built in which I can become a lyrical poet.
Wonderful. I love that. That's a beautiful thought. Makes all the sense in the world. And of course,
Yeah.
I had a lot of bad stuff in my past, my experiences. And so for me, narrative was scary. I mean, I'll admit that. Don't ever, if somebody says, oh, lyric is all there is, that's bullshit. All you're saying is like, I need lyric. So I'm going to defend it or I'm going to celebrate it. Yeah. No. I mean, it's the beautiful spectrum of it all, isn't it?
Right. Thanks, Tim, for that question, friend.
Yes, wonderful question. Thank you, Tim.
Am I supposed to read the questions? Because I'll do it with pleasure, or yes, I guess I am, right?
You're more than welcome to, whatever is easiest for you.
Or wait a minute, I'll just get them through mind reading.
How much time do we have left, Marcy?
We have until 6 o'clock, give or take.
6 minus 3 is 3. Okay, we have half an hour. Oh, that's good. Okay. I'm in California here, so I have to subtract every time. Is there anything that didn't make it into Primer for Poets that you wish you could have or still think about?
Golly.
This is a question from Christopher Miller.
The world of regrets.
Yeah.
Let's see. I was surprised how much I was able to get in of stuff that I really care about. There's certain things that I personally I'm very excited about that my editor wanted me to tone down.
Oh.
I think anybody who tries to tone me down should be celebrated. But I can't stop thinking about this as a project for poets and people who love poetry, which is the idea of making our own individual personal anthology of the poems that we love most of all. And I'm fascinated by that project. And I'm fascinated by the idea of like restricting it to 12 poems or 15 poems, just to make you suffer a little, and make you choose, make you throw away a poem that you adore in order to include another one. And then when you get done, these 15 poems, it's like, wow, I mean, this is you in another flesh, in the flesh of other poets imagined. I just think that's I can't enthuse about that enough as a project for people.
Wonderful project that is.
And yet, it can sound a little weird if you hear it the wrong way. I don't know.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Every time I read a poem that I love, I immediately go to my computer and type it.
Oh, that's cool.
And I have an anthology of about 1,000 pages because I've been doing that for 40 years. But I mean, I type it to learn it, to see how it was written, where the words were chosen, where the lines break, why there's a semicolon instead of a dash. And you embrace those poems in that way.
Wonderful.
There's a wonderful question here.
But no, I have to say, Laure-Anne,
yes.
Love what you said. I think it's so totally true. But now, torture yourself and take those thousands of poems down to 15. And what I'm going to say is that you'll be choosing what somehow is in essence, being alive for you.
And then print it and give it to your friends. Right?
That'd be pretty intense.
Those 15 poems, then you send them to your friends in a document. What a present, a distillation of that, How wonderful, how wonderful. Okay, a wonderful question here by, here. Richard Osler asks, Greg, thank you. I wonder what you think about the therapeutic nature of poetry as compared to poetry as craft and art.
Well, there's nothing, I think they're woven together. I think, as I say, to me, lyric is the story about trying to articulate your personhood, you know, your individual personhood, your experiences in the world, your emotions, your fears, your longings, your dreams. And that's also tied up with this is me trying to show something twined around with issues of healing and affirmation and so on and so forth. And I don't no, I mean, is Wordsworth trying to heal himself from the loss of his joy in nature when he says the world is too much with us, laden soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers? I mean, is that therapeutic? It's certainly, you know, I mean, who knows? Who knows? I don't, I think whatever feels right for the person, I think the more there's a great deep joy in craft, an inexhaustible joy in trying to learn the craft and feel that you're channeling or the aspects of the craft of poetry, and that they are tangled up with your own life.
There you go.
It makes sense. Well,
it's
you know,
that thing you did.
Yeah, it's that thing.
Yeah, it's that thing you did
Words
right now.
Words are meant to get that.
Yeah, yeah. What is poetry? It's that.
Glad you asked.
A question by Lenny de la Rocca. Oh, okay. Do you ever try to experiment with tone or voice, which perhaps makes you a little uncomfortable?
Sure. Can I think of anything in the moment? Probably not. Again, at my age, having written every day for about 55 years,
yeah,
I'd be glad to experiment with anything, just to have something happen on the page. You know, you get old and you start to get in all kinds of ruts after you've been writing for a while. And so you're always dreaming about experimenting with tone or content or anything. And that's, again, one of the freedoms of poetry, right? You can just,
it is. Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
If you see me squinting, it's because I'm trying to read the questions. Angela Torres says, one of the things we often invoked and found very useful at Warren Wilson during my MFA studies was your 4 temperament, story, structure, music, and imagination. In what way, if any, do these relate to the singing, saying, naming, and imagining?
Boy, that's an excellent question. Yeah. I've tried to figure that out and I haven't come up with anything. So if she figures it out, you should let me know. What I do know is that that 4 temperaments essay was a kind of early articulation. It was a lecture I gave at Warren Wilson, and many people still like it. I mean, still think, oh, that's the best he had to say about poetry. And I don't know, maybe they're right. But I wanted, you know what I felt with the naming, singing stuff, that's less prescriptive. It's more open-ended about poetry. Right. Whereas I think there was a little bit of pigeonholing going on in that 4 temperaments, and I apologize for that.
There's a very good question here by Charlie Cote. How do we make poetry more accessible to the young? I teach middle school.
Yeah. Gosh. I think that's a really good question. I think the desire to express yourself, the longing to express yourself is already present in them, in
Yes.
young people. And I think the thing that we have to do is partly is convince them that what's in them that gets articulated in trying to write is valuable. I mean, it's affirmation of their own being. The other answer, though, is all we have to do is say, hey, look, pop music, lyric poetry, same animal.
Yep.
Same
Yep.
animal. So
Yep.
nobody has to tell, a middle schooler that whatever form of rock and roll they love or songs they love, that they're important.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is convince them that, well, that's a form of poetry. Yes,
Yeah.
poetry on the page is a little more this and that and different.
And
But they're
start there. Start there.
Yeah, it's the same animal. I mean, Sappho,
Yeah.
nobody, Greeks didn't read their poems silently. They didn't even recite them. They sang them. They sang them and danced them. Ditto for the ancient Chinese poets. They were singing. So the singing brings not just the qualities of language, but it also brings the bodily qualities of dance. That again have this incredible power. When you're a young kid, if you can dance,
The moving with the words and the singing with the words. Yeah.
so liberating, isn't it?
Martha, your friend Martha Rhodes, my friend Martha Rhodes, Martha Rhodes of Four-Way Books, says, hi, Greg. Given yesterday Martin Luther King Day and this week, these past 4 years, I think of your commitment to the civil rights movement. I wonder if your work this past year has also been influenced by the unrest of these times.
Oh. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, Martha.
I have written a number of poems in the last year or two that are political, harshly political. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what to do with them because they, as somebody's talking about experimenting with tone, these don't sound like me in a sense.
Really?
Well, but America didn't look like the America we wanted to see either. It's hard to say. Yeah, I have written some poems that probably, more than I've ever thought of writing before.
There are some journals who would love them, I'm sure. So I would love them too. But it's true, at a certain moment, we have to speak, huh? Even if we keep silent for long and try to understand it, and suddenly we have to stand up and say something. And I'm fascinated by the fact that for certain poets, they can write it within the first day of things happening, and others need 2 years to make sense and then write it. We're all.
Well, I think the truth is, for me, with the political poems that I've written, is that I am letting them cool off because, to our own sorrow, many of us as poets have discovered that the poem written in the moment of passion, no matter how sincere, doesn't survive that moment so well. So even as I think that there's a need to respond urgently, I think there's also for us as poets wise advice, which is, yes, write it now, but maybe wait a while before you decide whether it's any good or not.
Exactly. Yeah. Tom Lux used to say, put it in your drawer and you'll see. It's amazing how the poem knows what to do when you take it out 3 months later.
Yes,
right?
perfect advice.
Yeah. And how we miss him. We have 10 minutes, so that's. I saw Vicky ask a fun question. If you could do your life as a poet, if you could start your life as a poet over, if you could start over your life as a poet, what would you do? What I mean is, how would you write? How would you study? What would you learn?
I've kept journals since 50 years.
Wow.
And so I can go back and find out what I was thinking and feeling and so forth on every day. I would, write, and then I would go to poems and stuff like that. So, and my experience, my memory of it is, kind of fairly vivid because of that. I stumbled, I suffered, I wrote terrible things, I was deluded, and I wouldn't change anything. I don't think there's any fast way to get there. I would never tell anybody how, this is what you need to do.
No.
I couldn't say that. I don't think we know, except by stumbling along through our lives and through our memories and all that stuff.
Another question by Karin. Your categories, naming, singing, etc., help me understand the range of poetry. Do you think poets are distinguished by their individual blends of these four things, emphasizing one, another emphasizing the other? How do you compare? That's a good question, actually.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. You look, let's say you love Gerard Manley Hopkins, for example. I mean, or Dylan Thomas. These are people who are sort of word drunk with singing. That's not all they do. Yeah. But their primary commitment to just having a hell of a time with sounds. Yeah. I don't think Dylan Thomas is a good example. Of course, nobody reads people anymore, but he's a good example of somebody who couldn't resist. He just couldn't resist following sounds up and down the pike and stuff. He was, a lot of his poems are just going nowhere because he's just having so much fun along the way.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
if I may name,
but people are definitely, people definitely have, I think, a kind of preference for this or that kind of language, or a gift for it, and that.
Word drunk. Yeah. What did you say? Word drunk. I want to remember that. Could somebody remind me? What did you say? Word drunk with? I'm so sad I couldn't write it down, but because it's so true. I would like to name a poet that for me teaches me all those different tonalities and variations in tone, and still have that absolute fervor of the lyric, and that's Bridget Pegeen Kelly. I find her our modern singer, if you wish, because there's sound and imagery and metaphor. Everything is mixed. Do you have that same admiration for her?
Well, I'm going to forget the name. Child song. I mean, that's one of the most astounding poems. It's
right.
And of course, this is it with a great poem. It's got everything. I mean, we begin here and go there.
It has narrative. It has lyric. It has. Yeah. For me, it's one of the most important poems of the 20th, and I'm sticking to my opinion.
Amen.
One more.
I can remember the first time I read that poem, and I just was stunned.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
wordless.
I've never read it since that I wasn't stunned. And as you say, then you sit down and you type it out and you try to figure out how she did it, and lots of luck. You know, you'll learn.
Lots of luck.
But ultimately, what you're looking at is, and I'm sure she felt this too. I mean, it was a moment of genius in the literal sense that her genius, her presiding spirit took over, or muse, or whatever you want. I mean, you don't put these poems together through intention or conscious. We all know that.
Right?
Something just, I don't want to minimize all the craft. That's all got to be there. But then ultimately, when a poem like that happens, it's happening. I think it's not being constructed.
Right. Thank you. I just wanted to talk. She was my teacher at Warren Wilson, and
Never met her.
it was a fabulous experience. Okay, another question. We have, good, 7 minutes. Okay. Clayton Verbinski says, I love how beautiful the beloved. What led you to the Parkington Sisters? What led to that cooperation, that mingling, that we will see tomorrow, right? Tomorrow? Yeah.
Yeah. So,
how did that happen?
Well, Martin Farwell, who runs the Dodge Festival, was inviting me to come there. I think it's the second time. And he said, there are these amazing singers, the Parkington Sisters, and they can take a poem and just sing it. He said, for a joke, or just to show what they could do, they took a poem of Billy Collins and they sang the same poem first as an Irish dirge and then as a girl pop band, the same song. So they just have that kind of amazing skill to take poems and make them song. So he said, would you like to do something like that with them? And I have this whole sequence of poems. I mean, it's really about 400 or 500 poems that are beloved poems.
The beloved poems, yeah.
I call them beloved poems. I don't know what to call them. But in any case, there they are. And so when Martin said, would you like to try to do that? I thought, well, that would be fun because the poems are deliberately very simple diction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're very transparent. So they closer to song in some ways like that. And he said, so I said, yeah, I'd like to try that. He said, well, would you do it? I could give you 10 minutes. I could give you 20 minutes. I could give you 50 minutes. Wow. And I thought, 50 sounds like a real challenge. Why not?
Yeah.
But if you're going to do this, what the hell?
Right.
And so then with my wife's help, I arranged a bunch of these beloved poems in a kind of implied narrative arc.
Right.
And then we did it. We only had 2 rehearsals before we performed it. And we, it was fun. It was the most fun I ever had in a poetry reading. And I hope, I hope some of that
I hope
fun
everybody,
do in a few days. What is it? I don't know when we're doing it. Anyway, this is a different one. And we had to do it separated.
Because of.
And so that changed it, but it's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Yes. And it was.
At 8 p.m. tomorrow night. And you will be amazed. I was in anyway. And to finish, we have 4 minutes because you mentioned Trisha, who is a fabulous artist, a fabulous painter. And so there's this poet, this lyrical poet, and this painter who makes work look like there's 8 dimensions on a piece of flat I mean, it's amazing what she does. And also I saw that you have a big painting of hers somewhere in your house where she painted a
Poem
poem.
painting, yes, yes.
Poem painting, right. So how is the conversation? Oh, and then I saw a painting of you at the Stop and Shop with, I mean, it's, and
Yeah.
then you have a scarf because it's winter, and then you are very much in her paintings. And I wrote something here that I,
Her website is triciaorr.com. It's TRISHAORR. Anybody wants to
right.
see her work, which I highly recommend.
And so, yes, and please go and look at that website because it's amazing. And so there's such a lovely inclusion in her art as you include her in your art. She includes you in her art, right? You're there and she's in your art. Wonderful, right? And I'm not sure that has existed before, that a painter and the poet include themselves and their relationship in their particular different arts. Or am I wrong?
No, but it's a nice idea. I mean, I haven't thought about it. I do know that I've been married. He's going to guess here. 47 years. As I say, we spent our honeymoon on cushions on Tom Lux's floor in his crummy apartment in Boston back in 1973.
In Watertown, Water something.
Somerville,
yes.
I think it was where he's living there. But you know, we're just, you know, we are each other's first audience.
Right.
And
right.
Rilke said one of these things once when I read it first as a kid before I was married. He said that part of marriage was guarding each other's solitude.
Mm.
And I thought that was kind of highfalutin and neurotic at the time. I don't know why, because I was a teenager, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I'd come around to thinking, yeah, we guard each other's solitude, because you need a lot of time to paint. You need a lot of time to write. So you need somebody who can respect that and both give you intimacy, but also give you space.
That's it. That's it.
I'm sure
Thank you, Gregory. It's, alas, we have to leave, but thank you for all your generous answers. And I hope you come back in a few years, because I have 78 more questions for you.
Yeah, well,
thank you with all my heart. And thank you to the audience, and thank you to Susan, and thank you to the questions. You will see there's some very lovely questions that we couldn't answer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the poets. If we were there, we would be clapping and roaring and standing up. I know we would. Our virtual bookstore will be open very shortly, and people can come and we can work on this signing virtually with Kevin, Prufer, Martha Rhodes, and Gregory Orr. And our kickoff reading tonight with Tim Seibles, Traci Brimhall, and Brian Turner begins at 8 p.m., followed by another virtual book signing in our Murder on the Beach virtual bookstore right after the reading. Thank you so much. It has been an incredible afternoon with you both. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Yes.